All right, good evening. Welcome to Learning and Teaching Committee. It is Tuesday, February 21st at 5:30. And we have an agenda that has one item on it, but we'll probably take some time for discussion. We have no citizens' comments, so we'll just go right into item 2 on our agenda, which is the Student Achievement Report. Turn it over to Dr. Igo.
All right, good evening. So this evening, we're going to take an opportunity to just kind of update our progress towards our goals that we set, the interim benchmarks for the 22-23 school year. So our outcomes really are just to update you on where we are in terms of the benchmarks, to also provide you an update on our progress towards the recommendations that we put into the report from November, as well as the updates where we are in terms of the curriculum and instruction that we discussed in the report, and then provide you an update on progress on those cohorts that are most impacted by the pandemic. So this really aligns with our policy related to school accountability and then our long-term goal to ensure every student has college, career, and life competencies necessary to produce post-secondary success. You've seen this slide before. This is really that idea around continuous improvement. And really what our focus this evening really is on tonight is, are we making progress towards our goals? Are we making them at a fast enough rate? So that's going to be what we're going to kind of talk through tonight. And then you've seen the theory of action also, where we talk about what are the things we need to do at the district level, to the building level, to teachers, so that students can achieve. And what we're talking about tonight really falls into the establish those systems for continuous improvement, and then aligning the work between the districts, the schools, and our classrooms. All right, so we're going to give you start with kind of a high level overview of our progress towards the 23 interim benchmarks. I want to remind you as we kind of walk into this, that those benchmarks are set for the state assessment. So they're set for how students do on IAR, and they're set for how students do on SAT. We do not have that data tonight. We'll be looking at iReady data and some other indicators kind of along the way. And our iReady data will focus on K-8, and then our high school will really be focusing in on our college and career indicators where appropriate. I think it's important as we look at this that we think in kind of two ways. One is that the students took this test back in December. So this really articulates their progress as it relates to the middle of the school year. And while it's February, we've had some time and we've been working towards that. But when I say things like we're going to make a hypothesis that they're going to meet that benchmark, keeping in mind that we had an entire half of year, even though we're kind of in February as we're reporting that back out. So this is kind of that high level overview of kind of where we are in terms of on progress or not on track to meet those indicators. Again, as we're looking at this data, we're not making an apples to apples comparison. So when we looked at the data, we really tried to take a deep dive into not only where are students today, how did this group of students perform previously, as well as how did the last year's group of third graders or fifth graders perform, so that we could make an educated hypothesis about whether or not we were on track to meet that goal. And so as you kind of take a look, you can see that our fifth grade cohort is really looking good. We believe that we're right on track and that we're likely to meet those outcomes. Grade 8, we'll talk a little bit more about that in ELA, where again, we're seeing that kids are on track and ready to roll with that. And our kids that are enrolled in advanced classes, that looks good as well. As well as our sixth graders transitioning into middle school, right? When we're looking at that GPA, we're seeing that looks pretty strong. Where we have some areas of growth and areas of things that we really need to focus in on, really revolves around that third grade ELA. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's not on this chart, but in the report that I provided, you'll see chronic absenteeism continues to be a problem. And then we have definitely some concerns as it relates to math, particularly in K2. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So they're just areas and things for us to kind of think through. Also, our ninth graders, as they're transitioning into high school, we're finding that to be maybe a little uneven. And that 10th grade group, we're going to continue to talk about them as well. Before we kind of jump in and take a deeper dive, I just wanted to kind of pull us back to where we've been in the past in terms of talking about that need for a guaranteed and viable curriculum. And that's really at the heart of what we need to start to move us in the right direction. And we've been working towards that. That's not something that's new. We've been working towards that. And it really involves instructional coherence and that effective collaboration. And so just to kind of put for you, like the things we've done to kind of put ourselves in a spot to make some moves forward is we've revised our curriculum assessment and instruction process. We've prioritized ELA and math as the two areas for curriculum, in particular ELA at K-8 and math at 9-12. That we are working towards developing common assessments so that we can start to have those conversations as they relate to the priority standards, as well as working to establish those priority standards in ELA and math. We will have those done by the end of this school year, as well as having a common scope and sequence and some pacing guides. So some of those things are kind of really in place. You've also heard us talk about the importance of those PLCs and really making sure we have that ongoing collaboration to make sure that every kid has a highly effective teacher in their classroom. We'll be doing that by including all of our teachers in establishing those priority standards, building a collective understanding as we do that about what does proficiency look like. Really diving into what does it mean to have evidence of student data and how do we use that to drive our PLCs, and that we need to have systematic curriculum focused professional learning, which you've seen us do as we rolled out phonics last year. And as we continue to roll that out this year, that's going to be a process that we continue kind of moving forward. I'm just going to kind of stop there because I realize I just kind of like spewed a lot of information. Any questions before we get into kind of the heart of the report? All right. We're just kind of looking at foundations for learning. You might remember that's really about sense of belonging, student-teacher relationships, as well as attendance. And there's some really positive things as you take a look at our scores from the fall, that we continue to see strong sense of belonging. Our kids are continuing to report that. They're continuing to report high student-teacher relationships. You might remember from November, we talked about elementary. The area of concern was peer-to-peer respectful interactions. It's not necessarily on there, but we have seen growth in that arena. When we looked at the scores from spring to fall, students were reporting more respectful interactions. And the same was true at secondary. We talked about our secondary students, that area of growth really was around being able to identify an adult, a trusted adult. And again, we saw it continues to be the lowest of all the questions, but we did see growth in that area. So more kids are reporting that they have that growth or that trusted adult. In terms of attendance, we've seen a slight increase in our average daily attendance, and we continue to see some district chronic absenteeism, and it's most concerning at high school, followed by elementary, and we've seen a good reduction at the middle school. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of how we're addressing that, but the high school is really taking a look at this, kid by kid and making sure they understand, how are they doing in terms of grades? Is this having an impact on their grades? Is this not having an impact on their grades? What might be the cause of that issue? How can we engage these students more and continue to find a problem solving way? How do I problem solve what's most important for these students? And how do we continue to get students into school? We do think we have a couple of areas that might be in terms of just housekeeping and how we're recording things that might be impacting that number. So we're continuing to unpack that to make sure we fully understand. These were the steps that we talked about putting in place for in the report. And it was making sure that our schools had SEL goals as it relates to building a sense of belonging. And then that we were actively monitoring student attendance data within that MTS system so that our schools could respond in a more timely manner.
I have a question in regards to attendance. So since I have been on the board, attendance has been an issue in the student achievement report. And what I'm trying to understand is, and maybe you can clarify this, or if we're not there yet with an answer, what are we doing differently? Because I understand that we've been also hearing that, oh, maybe how we're coding things or how we're recording things could be an issue. We've heard that before. So I'd really, historically, I don't know how this compares.
It's
This year at the high
similar.
school.
It's
So-
similar. Yeah.
So we're not seeing a change. So I'd like
Agreed.
to know more about what we're gonna do to really make an impact on this, because this is pretty low. We're barely making the cut here.
I'd agree. I'd agree.
Um,
I think one of the things that as we look is, as we've been kind of diving into that data, really thinking of that, we need to think beyond about attendance, right? And we need to start thinking about what does student engagement look like? And are we meeting the academic needs of our students? And we are seeing some kids where they're not coming to school and it's not impacting their grades, which absolutely means that we need to take a look at our curriculum. So part of the work of kind of that guaranteed and viable curriculum and those priority standards will help us to up the rigor, which we're hoping will also have an impact on our attendance. I can't guarantee you that that's what's going to happen, but we have kind of said we need to step back and think a little bit more systemically, as well as addressing kind of those individual needs kind of along the way.
Thank you.
Sure.
Just to piggyback off that, do we know like a proportion of what's excused or unexcused, or maybe that's not the language that is used internally, but do we know, are these students calling off or just not showing up?
So these are chronic absenteeism actually relates to when you've missed more than 10% of the school day, whether it's excused or unexcused. And so as we dig, it's a little bit of everything, right? Sometimes it's a kid who got, at the beginning of the school year, an illness that ran for a couple of days that's put them in that high risk range, and they might come out of it, if they aren't sick again. Sometimes it's being called in, sometimes it's a combination. I would say it's fair to say there's lots of, sometimes it's a chunk, but it tends to be more intermittent are the ones that we're trying to really attack, right? It's not an ongoing absenteeism for whether it's a mental health need or a physical need, but those intermittent ones are the ones we're trying to put our fingers on to see if we could. That seems to be where we think we can make progress. Yeah. All right, so this is our iReady scores. And if you remember, this gives us an outline of our students kindergarten through 8th grade. And we start really with a focus on those kids in grades 3, 5, and 8, as they are, those are the areas that we're monitoring. And you can see that in ELA for 5th and 8th grade, we're seeing strong achievement as well as strong growth. And for our 3rd graders, we are definitely seeing some strong achievement and some strong growth. However, given where they were last year and kind of the rate, we're not confident that they're going to be able to make our benchmark as it's set for this year. So just to kind of walk you through that graph, I'm sorry, I should have started there. The top graph really tells you where kids are in the fall to where they are in the winter. And that represents kids that are at the mid to above grade level placement, right? So those are the students that are most likely to meet on IAR because they are already at mid to above grade level. At the bottom, you will get is our students as they are on track to meet their typical growth target as well as their stretch growth target. And so we really look for kids in the typical growth target. We want to see kids at least 50% or more on their way towards meeting that target. And for stretch, we want to see that at 30% or more. So you can see that kindergarten, the percent that are on track to meet their typical growth is lower than 50%, which is an area of concern for us, as well as the 33% of students at mid to above grade level. And that really has to do with students not being where we would have anticipated when we compare them to other cohorts of kindergarten students. And we typically see more growth from our kindergartners. So we are definitely concerned about that kindergarten group.
So what is the benchmark that we're measuring against?
in terms of.
How are you determining what's green
Oh.
versus red?
So I really tried to kind of analyze that in the report to kind of provide that. So we used a couple of different things. We went to look at what was their overall percentile ranking. Did we see growth from winter to winter in their percentile ranking, which would show growth? We looked to see how quickly that they were growing over time. Then we looked to see how did that particular cohort and where did they score at this time last year, or not this cohort, that grade level, and where did they end up scoring on the IAR? And so we used all of that information to make a determination as to, again, it's an educated guess as to whether or not we feel like they're likely to meet our benchmark that we set.
And if I can just ask another,
Just a one follow-up related to the growth targets or related to the mid to above grade level placement? What context were you talking about there?
We used all of it to make a determination as to whether or not they would meet the interim 2023 benchmark.
Yes.
Yes,
I guess that's what I'm trying, because it's tough. 'Cause
it's
It's
tough.
not on the table. The benchmark is not on the table, so I'm trying to reorient myself where that is.
So if you back of the packet, and then if you look at the front one had the actual score in it. So third graders would have to hit 58% on IAR in order to be on track.
So just to clarify,
Third graders, I'm sorry, I said fifth, I meant third.
Dr. Igo, what you're trying to do here is use the iReady insights to predict IAR performance. Is that
That
right?
is correct.
So, Ms. Fairgrave, when you talk about the benchmark, are you talking about the IAR benchmark or iReady
Yeah.
distances?
I apologize.
I just my opinion, as these slides are developed going forward, I would have also a column that has the benchmarks, because otherwise, if you just have this chart, it's challenging to understand exactly what the story is that would be my suggestion.
And I'm happy to do that. The reason I didn't do that is because it's not apples to apples, right? I'm not making, but I understand and we can do that. I can do that moving forward.
so just to clarify, so the mid to above, 42% of our students
Of third grade students.
are not going to hit the
So
benchmark.
42% of our students are currently scoring at the mid to above grade level on
Are-
iReady.
But that's red
Because the
it doesn't-
goal on IAR is 58%. And while I absolutely think we will have more students score proficient than we did last year, given our focus on ELA, I do not believe we are likely to hit 58%. Because last year our third graders were scoring in the same range and they did not hit the goal last year. Does that make sense?
Quick question, and maybe this was indicated in the packet and maybe I missed it, so I'm sorry. When it says benchmark 22, 23, is that winter, spring, fall, end of year?
It's the score on the IAR assessment, so that we'll get that in the spring.
Okay, so the benchmark 22 is spring for ELA proficiency for third graders. 53% is spring of
I'm gonna go here.
22, so last spring.
This
Is
was
that
last
right?
year's.
Okay,
goal.
I just want to
Yep.
make sure. Thank you.
Mhm.
I have a question. So shouldn't we be equally as concerned about our second, first, and as well as the kindergarten? I mean, as I'm looking at this, given there's less than half a year left for these students, especially the second graders who next year will then be.
Third graders. Yeah, I'm gonna talk a
Yes.
little bit about both kindergarten and second grade, kind of moving on. And our first graders are showing significant growth. And they have traditionally, this particular cohort has shown big growth from winter to spring, which was why we weren't quite as concerned. Can I answer other questions? And this was provide you an update on those recommendations from November. You can see that, most of them are either in progress or completed. Probably the one that is, that last one is that CAA process where we focus on a resource that addresses informational text and written expression, including responding to text. That's been an ongoing project. We're doing some field testing currently and we will be implementing new next year, which we believe will significantly help our students. Because we know it's informational tasks and responding in writing that is creating issues or concerns. So this kind of gives us an overview of our math. Again, that grade 5 cohort has strong achievement and growth and is likely to meet that 2023 interim benchmark. Grades 3 and 8 are more difficult to make a prediction. Grade 3, there is less than expected growth. And at grade 8, the national percentile remains stable from winter to winter, which caused us a little bit of concern. While the district generally performs well when students have to write about their math, which isn't something that's scored on the iReady assessment. So we were trying to take that into account as well. But we definitely have concerns as they fall K1-2 for our students in math. We have kids that in kindergarten and second grade, you see those growth targets for typical are less than 50%, which is concerning to us. As well as we had less students showing that they were ready for mid to above grade level, working on mid to above grade level placement. Any questions I can answer as it relates to math?
So following kind of your rubric here, if I look at math, just looking at your yellow box in cell winter 3, 21%, that's yellow. Right. So
Yep.
we have a movement from fall to winter, moving from the bottom row to the top of 14 percentage points.
Correct.
So when I consider that, and I'm looking here at the chart from the student achievement report, the goal for IAR proficiency is 63%. So I see if we had a 1-to-1 correlation in IAR winter or IAR to winter iReady, we'd say we have a 40% challenge or 40-point challenge on our hands. Is that about right?
That is. And so just to put some context to why we said yellow and not red, was we went and we looked where were third graders at this point in time last year on the winter iReady, and they scored similar. And then we looked at where they ended up scoring on IAR.
Right.
And then they scored, I don't have it right in front of me at the moment, but they had they made enough progress for us to put that almost in the green.
I get it. So the linkage, what I hear you saying is the linkage between IAR winter performance as a predictor, an iReady winter performance as a predictor of IAR suggests that a lower iReady still can predict a higher IAR score at the end.
Correct.
Okay.
Because we do so well on the written part of the math, which isn't accounted for here.
Yeah.
And please know, like we're only 3 years into iReady, so we're just getting enough data for us to look back and say, well, what did last year's group do and how did they perform here? And I'm very hopeful that over time, this will become a much more precise. We're just trying to take all the information we have and try to make our very best educated guess as to what we think will happen.
Thank you.
If you take a look at our math, just kind of the recommendations we had, many of them are already completed. We're continuing to work with our 6th grade. Again, we had talked in the fall about our 6th grade really being stuck, right? We hadn't seen those scores grow and we were going to dig in. So that committee is up and running. And it's really doing some really not committee is probably not the right word. It's the PLC doing that work. And we're really starting to see them understand and looking for ways for us to be able to improve those scores. Just taking a look at our Algebra 1. So our students in 8th grade. So just kind of walk you through this chart. We've got the cohort enrollment. So that's all of the students in the class of 2027. of all the students in the class of 2027, 42% have either already completed Algebra 1 or are currently enrolled in Algebra 1. And then on track, the 40% are students that are, if they're currently enrolled, are earning either have already passed the course or at least earning a C if they're currently enrolled in that course. And we've marked that one red because we do not have enough students enrolled in Algebra 1 to meet the benchmark. We needed to be at 45% of kids enrolled because our benchmark is 45%. Algebra 2, same concept. An enrollment of 987 students. So this is the class of 2024. 92% of them have already taken or are currently enrolled in Algebra 2. Of those, 78% of them have already earned the credit or are currently earning a C or better. So you can see that one's yellow because depending on how those student scores turn, it's likely that we will hit an 80, I think it's 86% for Algebra 2. Which is why that score is yellow.
And that's a graduation requirement, right? Algebra 2?
It's 3 years of math is a requirement. Is Algebra 2 a requirement? Oh, it is. Okay. I lied. Yes. I thought it was. So that is at 86%. So there's a good chance that we might hit that because our goal again is that we're constantly using those common benchmark assessments. We're really focused in on our priority standards and we're helping kids to move and grow through the process. On a college and career readiness. This kind of gives us a high level look. That top box really walks us through successful transition. So we talked about that GPA of B or better being an indication as to whether or not kids are transitioning well and successfully. And our 6th graders really look really good. We're really right on track to meet that. Our 9th graders, our current freshmen, that's lower, 62%, and that's lower than previous cohorts when we've looked at previous cohorts over the years. And probably the piece that's standing out to us is that 96% of freshmen are on track to graduate in 4 years. That's a pretty big leap. That means we have a lot of kids earning C's and D's because that is really not failing a class, right? And so that means kids are certainly doing okay and but they're definitely struggling because we want to make sure we want to see that at a B or better. And then in the bottom there, you can take a look at enrollment in advanced courses. You can see that at the middle school, we're seeing a nice steady increase from 57 to 58 to 74 of total enrollment. But what's interesting is those numbers are mostly coming from math and not from ELA. Our ELA numbers are lower. Where again, an educated guess is related to the writing piece that we know that's the piece that kids are struggling with when it comes to being admitted into AT. So our focus this year on writing, and then as we're looking at a resource that incorporates writing, we're hoping to see those scores go up as we kind of look over time. And you can finish one lesson, and then we can see kids enrolled in AP or dual credit by the year that by their year. We see that steadily increases. And when we compare that to previous years, we have more kids taking early college credit courses. Mrs. Bell.
Sorry, thank you. Would one factor with the difference between higher level advanced classes, math versus ELA, be that there is only one level of an advancement for language arts, as opposed to math students could do standard, advanced
Oh, I see what you're
AT?
saying.
Is that, I don't know if that's a factor or not, but I'm wondering if possible it is.
But that exists for ELA as well. You can take honors or you can take an AP.
In middle school?
In
Or
middle
I'm sorry. I'm disjointed.
Yeah, no, that's
Thank
an
you.
excellent point.
I get confused.
Yeah,
I was like, we do?
disjointed.
It's awesome.
Now,
Wait, what?
I definitely, as we are digging into kind of gifted education over time, and really looking at our AP and our AP audit, right? As we've been like gathering that information, I think something that has definitely come to light and we need to really address is the idea of acceleration. And in ELA, we're not necessarily accelerating, we're enriching. And so one of the things we need to do is really look at how do we how do we move to acceleration versus enrichment for our gifted students? And I think that would help improve those scores too, right? Like, and the writing, and full, as we look at those, writing is an issue. It's definitely an issue. And so like we've put a lot of time and effort into really working with our teachers on understanding the importance of that. And really the importance of thinking of writing beyond what I did last weekend or what I did on my summer vacation to how do I use my text how do I write to support my thinking, right? Which is a different type of writing. And in elementary school, we tend to not focus there. So really helping teachers to refocus their thinking and their instruction to support, how do I use writing to support my thinking?
So Dr. Igo, these numbers in the bottom left chart, the enrollment in advanced, that's inclusive of AT as well as the Infinity program.
It is anybody who's enrolled in an advanced course. Yes.
So I think Mrs. Ferry, when we talk about years of acceleration on the math side of Infinity, it's 2 years ahead of standard. And what I hear you saying, Dr. Igo, it's not necessarily the case for
ELA.
ELA.
That is correct. So again, this just kind of gives you an update on where we are in our progress towards the recommendations that we made. As you can see, most things are in progress. We have completed making sure our PLCs, our AP teachers have PLC partners Cross River if they were a singleton. And that we are anticipating bringing the AP audit recommendations to the board we'll start in April with some learning and then finishing that up in May with the actual recommendations.
Can I ask one follow-up? Back on the on track for graduation. When you looked at that, do we have a normal distribution of the grade A, B, C, and D? Is it a normal distribution that makes up that 96% or?
It's a really, my guess, I didn't look at it that way.
Okay.
Something I could absolutely
Okay.
do. But given the difference between a B average and kids on track tells me that it might not be an equal distribution. But I will
Okay.
look and I will
Is
double check
that,
it.
yeah, is that something that you could provide as just a follow-up to the board on what those buckets look
Yep.
like? For me, it would be concerning if there's a tail with the D.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's a fair question. It's a
Yeah.
fair question.
Okay.
Thank you.
But before we go to the next section, I have a couple of follow-ups on these sections. In the opening, you talked a little bit about developing common assessments. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the progress being made around common assessments and where across the range of grades from pre-K through 12 is that making the most progress, and how's that going?
Yeah, I would say the place that we've had the most consistent progress is really our high school math. So when we talked about kind of prioritizing that, we worked last year to identify those priority standards. And then we came together over the summer and built benchmark assessments that they are using, that they administer 4 times a year. So instead of doing it after every unit, they are administering it 4 times. And they're utilizing that information to drive those conversations in their PLCs. And I feel really confident that data is being well used and that it's giving us information as to where kids are performing. At ELA in high school, they also added some of those formative or those common assessments. I think that there's still room for us to continue to grow there in terms of where are we using that data? How are we mining that data? I think they're still in the process of learning how to really that inter-rater reliability because it's more about writing and using rubrics. But I think in the next year, as we continue to fine tune, that will get better with time.
I hope that now that you've kind of outlined where those prioritizations have taken place, when we look at performance data, even from this year, when we get to SAT data, since math is one and in high school math is what you talked about specifically, we can look at whether or not that's had an impact, positive or negative, in this year's performance. And then we would expect to see that positively increase over time. So when we talk about that change of common assessments, let's link it back to the data and say,
Yeah.
we talked about common assessment. Well, we should see it in the math SAT
Yep, we sure should.
first.
Mhm.
And let's keep an eye on that. the next question is both in ELA and in the math summaries in terms of qualitative updates or action updates, if you want to call them such. You have a task that says develop structures for intra-district networking for grade/PLC teams, and they're both marked completed. So a two-part question here associated with that. What does it mean that these are completed? And once we've talked about that, how does the completion sustain itself over time, get better, and contribute to positive outcomes?
Yeah. And so I had marked those complete as because it was about getting the systems and structures in place. So really making sure that there were avenues for those grade levels to meet and have conversations. And so we're hopeful that once we have those systems in place, we will then continue to utilize those. I believe we're going to have to, as we continue to build out kind of our PLC work, we've been talking a lot about like horizontal coming together as a horizontal grade level versus vertical. And that would allow us to like lean into those structures to ensure that people are having those conversations, because it was 4th and 5th grade, right? Am I right? I don't look at it.
I saw it in the K-8.
Okay.
I saw it in the K-8.
So to tag on to that, when it is completed, do we have then the next steps? So what you're going to do next?
I do not have, I don't have that. I can get that for you into how we're helping them work through that process. Can certainly do that.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. That's really like, how are they working?
Because ultimately where we want to be with the common assessments are not just for the high school math. We want to see data in front of our teachers that's no older than 5 days old. So that's where we ultimately want to be, is continuously looking at evidence of student learning. So our educators are reflecting on their instructional practices and how are we continuing to grow our students. 4 is a really great place for us to start from those large overarching, but we really do want to be looking at, and again, from assessments being exit tickets to a very brief intermittent assessment, but we are moving towards more assessment data that we're collectively looking at, putting into the hands of our PLC so we can be more actionable instead of, again, waiting for an end of a unit, which is actually too often too late for many students. So we will be putting that into place in the coming, that'll be a lot of that work as we were working into this next year.
Mr. Lechner, did I answer your questions?
Oh, you did.
Okay.
I understand. I have one more.
Oh, okay.
On the math K-8 update. You talked same kind of concept. You talked about evaluating the geometry progression from kindergarten to 3rd grade to determine if the adjustments are needed. It's completed, and I just wonder what those adjustments are.
Yes.
The scores would suggest some adjustments
All right, I'm
needed.
gonna have to phone a friend.
Yeah.
To Mrs. Kate, because she actually did that work with the team, so she can talk about exactly what adjustments were made. Sorry.
Will be no $1 million prize today. Sorry.
So when we looked at the 2nd grade data, one of the areas, for example, that stood out was the geometry progression. Our students were lacking a particular standard in division and partition of geometric shapes, which is the language of 1/2, 1/4, 1/3, which is foundational absolutely to 3rd grade fraction concepts. So we realized, like, if we don't have that in place, then that impacts 3rd grade, which, like, that fraction strand is so important. So what we did is started with the math specialist. So growing our big people first, we attacked that geometry progression, K3, and followed that. So we could see that coherence that is actually in the standards. And then we found that one standard. We went back into iReady, looked at those assessments to see what it was kids couldn't do, and then how to show teachers what that looks like in the classroom. So first with the math specialist, and the math specialist took that back to the elementary schools in all the buildings. And it's completed because we understood the progression, and then we shared the progression with teachers as well. So we know what we're working on now, and some of the changes that we made in the new edition of Eureka Math Squared, the geometry unit has been moved earlier than the year. So one of the issues is it always comes after we give IAR.
I just have a quick question. As you're talking about growing at the big people, we often see that teachers may be out for part of the year and a sub is then in place. How are we ensuring that the subs are then getting the same instruction or getting something with, the math specialists to support them?
So the beauty of the PLC structure is that sub is in that planning group with all the veteran teachers on that team. So they have all that expertise. And we also tend to flood that long-term sub with support from the reading specialist, the math specialist, and the instructional support coach.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. The same message will hold here, especially if we know that IAR does a good job, and you've told us it does, of testing to the standards. If we know we've had a missing standard on this geometry progression, I would expect that IAR should reflect positive movement, particularly there. It'd be worth, if we have question level data, looking at whether or not we've actually nailed it.
Absolutely. That'll absolutely be our work as we continue to move through.
If I can chime in, there's a new assessment from iReady called the Standards Mastery. So instead of when we take the diagnostic, it assesses all the standards for the whole year at the grade level, but Standards Mastery focuses on one standard. So that particular geometry standard, and then it's 5 questions on that standard. And it's very rigorous. It's very similar to IAR. And it kind of has the whole span from like all kids should be able to do this to maybe our most accelerated students should be able to do this question. And then teachers can use that assessment after instruction, or there's an A form and a B form. So mid and S, they really can use it formatively. And that's a new assessment that we're trying out with different teams to say like, then we can look at our common assessments. Are they rigorous enough? So if I've taught the 3rd grade fraction unit, I'm giving the Standards Mastery and iReady for the 3rd grade fraction standard, and I'm comparing the data. Do they show me the same things? So that's leading us to go back and actually work on some of our assessments in the elementary school.
Thank you. I forgot about that.
So quick question just to add to that, because it's related to Mr. Lackner's question. And it's one of the things that I found myself thinking about as I was looking at all of these projections. So given that we have a number of interventions coming in place and we're kind of using prior year's growth mid-year to the end of year to anticipate that growth, would we say that these are relatively conservative projections and that we actually in the future, as these interventions start to take place, that we would see potentially larger jumps, certainly at least comparable jumps, but meaning,
Yeah.
so some of these where we're thinking that we may fail to meet that, would we potentially see with these interventions, with the various formative and common assessments that we'll be using, that those jumps perhaps will be larger in the future? Is that what we're hoping?
That's what we're hoping for. Absolutely. Absolutely. I feel fairly confident if it's green that, I mean, of course, I feel fairly confident. If it's red, I feel fairly confident that we're probably not going to make that. The yellow is where I think that there's movement, depending on, like, we put some things in place and we've seen some like that it could go one way or the other. That helps. And I hope, another 3 years when we've got 6 years of data, I'll be far more accurate in those projections.
Well, and just to tag along, what you're really doing is, it isn't interventions as we tend to think of it. It isn't, this is a foundational switch in
Yes.
a guaranteed and viable curriculum with a PLC process, with multiple assessments being used within a learning unit so that teachers can adjust.
Yes.
So
the end
I
goal.
think
Yes.
it's
100%.
Yes.
I think the other piece, it is, what we're working towards is first best instruction. Our core instruction has to improve. It can't be about an intervention or anything else. As we look at these scores across the board, we have to get better at our core instruction, what we deliver. And it's everything you just said, Mrs. McCabe. It is that guaranteed and viable curriculum. That first grade is the first grade across this district. That ninth grade is the ninth grade across our district. This is the standard. It's a high expectation, and we'll achieve it through these different structures, the PLCs, the assessments, all of those aspects will continue to get to where you're talking about, Mr. Kuchar, where in years to come, we should anticipate higher achievement by the mid-year and higher growth, because I believe we're going to end up knowing our kids even better academically, social, emotionally, because we continue to have these robust, ongoing, formative assessments to have evidence of student learning. So absolutely. But yeah, we have to take care of core first.
All right, so taking a look at those kind of most impacted by the pandemic. And this group here is our current 10th graders. It's a little bit of a celebration here. And as we talk about those common benchmark assessments that we've been using in math, one of the things that we've been able to do is we kind of monitored the progress of our students in grade 10 on those assessments. And the majority of our grade 10 students are demonstrating proficiency on those geometry standards. And you may or may not remember in the fall when we talked about this, we were concerned about this group, particularly in geometry, because during the pandemic, when we were reducing standards, geometry were some of those ones, and we were concerned that they would have some holes. So the good news is that they are definitely showing some progress there, and we are feeling good about that. However, when we look at the overall GPA, we are seeing fewer students than anticipated with a B GPA. So again, we looked at this particular cohort in comparison to other cohorts, over time, and definitely less students. So we are definitely continuing to kind of work through. We believe we have some kids with both our 9th graders and our 10th graders, some students with some definitely those learning to learn behaviors, those executive functioning skills that we're working to kind of incorporate in. If you take a look, this is our current grade 9. These are the kids that were most impacted. Again, looking at those benchmark assessments, the students that we have enrolled as freshmen in Algebra 1, we are showing that they are struggling to master those priority standards. That heart of algebra domain continues to be an area of concern. And so we've been meeting with those, our math coordinators been meeting with those PLCs and really working towards, here's the priority standard. We got to go back. We're not done. We got to continue to fill these holes kind of along the way. And again, we talked a little bit about this group and not about that GPA of B or better, not being as high as we would anticipate it to be. So, our teams are really working hard to try to meet these students where they're at, put in the supports that they need by focusing in on those priority standards. And for our current eighth grade students, you might remember in the fall when we looked at their ELA scores, they were like on track. And so we really said we're going to continue to focus here in the area of math. And this, we've seen overall high levels of growth and achievement, both in ELA and math for this group. So we're feeling, again, as you'd seen, pretty confident that this group is going to meet the 2023 benchmark. Here's our current 2nd graders. And in ELA, we did see some nice, strong achievement and high levels of growth. And while if they continue on with this growth, now these guys are 2nd graders, so we're looking at the 2024 benchmark for these students, but we're feeling pretty confident in them, given the 2 things that we have changing, right? We've got the impact or the focus on writing that we haven't had starting in 2nd grade, and we'll have a new resource that really is going to be building those skills along the way. So we're feeling rather confident. For math, though, we're not feeling quite as confident in math. Achievement and growth has really slowed for this cohort. And if we want to meet that 2024 benchmark, we're really going to have to accelerate their growth in order to move them forward. And I know that We've been working with our math specialists to really focus in on what it is that they need so that we can continue to kind of move them forward. And then our kindergarten students. We really have some overall concerns. We noticed as kindergartners came in the fall, they were less likely to be at the mid to above than we had seen in the previous year. And we saw less growth from fall to winter than we had seen with previous cohorts. And that percent that's met their typical growth target is also lower than we had seen. We usually see a little bit more growth. So we are continuing, it's in both ELA and math. You know, as we've been problem solving, there's a lot, you know, there's many reasons for that. And I think one is that we have a significant number of new kindergarten teachers this year. So we've been working to support them, as well as this is a group of kids that if we think about what their early childhood looked like, was during the heat of the pandemic, and they didn't have probably a lot of the experiences that typical 3 and 4-year-olds have in terms of trips to the zoo, trips to the museum, those dates, all those things that we know helps to build students' background knowledge, their vocabulary, things like that. So we have to really be thinking about how are we building that in kind of along the way. Questions I can answer for you.
Just a quick one back to current grade 9. I think you told me this previously, but the reduction in the students earning a grade of B or higher, we have it at 62%. Do you recall what the prior year was or a couple years prior was?
I have that information. I don't have it in front of me, but I'm happy to share it with you. Yeah.
Previously,
Yeah,
so
I'm happy to share
just
the
for a
cohort
reference
data.
point of
Sure.
how much that's dipped. Thanks.
And so with second grade in particular, is it typical to have a drop? We're still in an untypical time, right? I mean, we're not pre-COVID yet. So is it a curricular issue? When you had to dig into the standards, shouldn't our curriculum have addressed that? What's your thinking when we look at it?
If we talk about second grade in particular, those were our kindergarten students. Remember, they only had a 2-hour kindergarten day that year, and that really did impact numeracy was really the thing that they got less of in that day. Reading was so important for them, so they had less numeracy, and we definitely saw the effects of that in the number and operations domain. One of the interventions we've been using is the building fact fluency with K2. So that's really working on routines for not only flexible and adaptive thinking with addition and subtraction, but also getting that automaticity together for K2. So that's really the area that we're struggling with. So when we get to the end of second grade, like adding and subtracting within 100 is supposed to be fluent. And that's something across all schools we're seeing students struggle with, but we know it backs up to being fluent within 10 and then within 20 and then within 100. So that's been our focus in number and operations for that group. And I don't think I know it's not a curriculum issue. It is, that's lasting effects from the pandemic, because that cohort we've been watching since kindergarten.
Do we have an anticipated time frame roundabout of when those interventions will manifest themselves and these students will be up to speed, to the standard?
Well, they have terrific growth right now. So I am hopeful, but I'm more than hopeful. I'm very confident that we're going to continue to see that gains and that growth. It's so important that we can measure that growth right now, and we're not waiting to that lag measure at the end of the year to see how they did. And that we're also able to identify what's been holding them back, which is the number and operations, right? So once we have a target, like we can do it.
Is there something additional that we need to do for this group? I've been saying the same thing since, we've been looking at data following their kindergarten year. I'm just wondering if there's something additional we can do. I understand you're providing an intervention during the school day. Is there something outside of the school day that may need to happen, or even during the summer? kind of thinking outside of just the right now and what we're doing.
But I think when I think about what that might mean or what that would look like, I think again, it's really most important that we're putting everything within context for kids and that we're building it within their day. And that constant kind of repeat, like we know summer school per se doesn't necessarily show growth, right? The research on summer school wouldn't necessarily say that might necessarily pull that through, nor does tutoring necessarily. The research on tutoring show that that's the best way. The research talks about utilizing your moments in time and accelerating and then teaching to mastery.
Yeah,
I
on
don't know
that
if you have
note,
anything to add.
on the note regarding, because I kind of had the similar thoughts to Mrs. Barker, and I think that a lot of that research is maybe doesn't take into account things like a pandemic. And so I think that when we're talking about people who are lagging behind, I think maybe some targeted interventions might be in order. And I think that most of the board would have the appetite for supporting whatever was necessary there.
Yeah, I
won't
do
speak
want
for
to.
the rest of you, but I know I
Yeah,
would.
I do want to clarify that research isn't necessarily comes from things like following Hurricane Katrina, following like when people have had like losses of education, like losses of school due to I'm going to call it natural disasters, really does show that it's best to accelerate and continue to keep, like remediation doesn't necessarily get us where we need to be. It's really best to stay in that time frame and accelerate and stay to those grade level standards. Not to say that we can't explore, but I would want to make sure that what we're doing was going to give us a benefit.
I don't know that Hurricane Katrina and those other things, I don't know that they had the same lasting impact in that, I don't know that we had people that essentially really lost 2 years of school, of in-person school. So I think that I'm just looking at targeted interventions. I'm not necessarily saying that we have to revamp everything. Looking at targeted interventions for those students who are struggling as a result of the pandemic and as a result of losing that kind of education during that period of time.
And just to tag, I think identifying what standard is not being taught can happen at any time during a school year. We shouldn't have to wait to find out what we failed at. We should be on target. So thank you for doing that and moving teachers to make those adjustments, at least with the geometry. So that is our work. That's our job. So we should be on top of that, no matter what other interventions might happen.
We did implement Zern, which is correlated and linked lesson by lesson to our Eureka Math curriculum. And it does let students accelerate. So I can work at my own pace through Zern. It has artificial intelligence, which is showing great promise for students. So if I'm in my grade level lesson, so I'm not set back a grade level. I'm on my grade level lesson today. But if I'm struggling, let's say with that fluency of addition within 20, it's going to take a step back and kind of give me a boost. Oh, here's a double strategy you could use to help you with that problem. So it gives them exactly what they need at that moment so we can keep them at grade level. And the research on acceleration in Zern from the pandemic, so millions of students using that system, has shown that students who had that just-in-time on grade level instruction and support had more than half a year's growth in students that got remediation. So like putting him back, if I'm in second grade, putting him back and just letting him work in first grade material. So it's giving him access to the grade level content with the support that they need. And so all of our elementary students have access to Zern. Parents can be using it with their students at home too, in addition.
Would that include then over summer months? I mean, this is something that's intimately close to me. My daughter's actually in this age group. So I've spoken with a lot of parents in the community who have echoed those exact same sentiments. And I agree with you. Remediation is not necessarily the answer at all, but just having additional opportunities for acceleration, whether that be during the traditional school year into the summer months or those other opportunities. Because I know whether the research supports it or not, a lot of folks are seeking out additional opportunities to try and enhance that particular student group's growth. And so if we can just think creatively about how we might be able to extend that, even if it isn't like a summer school, like you mentioned, if the research isn't supporting that, just what other resources we could make available. And I think that would be comforting to the community.
Let us think about that. I'm sure we can find a way to get creative.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
we
just,
have
I
both
want to
Zern
make
and
sure.
iReady.
I think Zern is great. I don't disagree with that, but there's something I think we keep talking about, like iReady and there all these things are, computer based. There's something to be said about teacher mediated instruction. I mean, to increase some of these concerns that we're having. So I'm asking that we think especially about this group, because this is the most impacted group we have, and this is going to go up. And as they get older, it's going to continue to be an issue if we don't really put a focus on this.
It sounds to me like what CERN is doing is allowing us to see those things where someone's not as where those things maybe aren't at the tip of their tongue, but they're able to go back and do that. I'm not objecting to that. I'm in support of that. I want to make sure that we're using that data and we are catching these kids up, because there was a lot of loss, and I've heard much of the same as Mr. Kuchert has. That there's a great deal of concern about that. So if we have ways to have immediate data that can say this is where someone needs some additional support, targeted support, then let's use that. And again, I think for my part, I'm in support of whatever we need to do to get these kids caught up, because we do have a group of a couple years worth of kids that have fallen behind.
So
I think one thing to consider is that these tools that you talk about, they're fantastic. And the more that we can create the broadest possible exposure and concurrent encouragement for use is important. And I'll stress that, and I think it's an and strategy. I think Mrs. Barker's point about the value of teacher mediated instruction is present also. And so the challenge I think that we're seeing or feeling as we look at these numbers is that folks are not yet recovered from pandemic experience, and they have a distance to further travel. And while all the things that you've laid out are really positive, I think what you're hearing from the board is there more that can be done? And what does it look like? And does it cover on all of those things, self-directed additions to in school day work, as well as anything additional? And so I think the floor is open and the challenge is laid before you. Let's think as creatively as possible across all modes to look at it. And while, I appreciate maybe as much as anybody at the board, the idea of the cost benefit on these things, let's see what they are. Because if we haven't seen even a presentation of, hey, we could do this, but it's expensive, then we're not in a position to allocate any resources. So
No,
the more we
that's
can
fair.
do, the better.
That's fair. I think we can absolutely do that and kind of talk through what would the research say about what's the impact of that, and let you all make some decisions. Absolutely.
To your point, Mr. Lackner, I think one of the things we also need to take into consideration as we are trying to figure out what are the best ways we can support these students is that different students learn differently, and remediation in the classroom might be really good for some or might not be as successful as others, whereas online platforms might be a little bit more beneficial to this particular student. And so I think the more we can look at, the more we can offer, the better. That would be successful. Obviously, we don't want to just hand out a worksheet and say, good luck. The more we can offer that is proven to show results for support and remediation, I think is the best case scenario. So I appreciate that you're looking into
Sure.
many possibilities.
Sure. We'll definitely come back to the board with some thoughts and ideas, as well as what does the research say about remediation, what that would look like, I think you need to have all that information so that you can make a valid and informed decision.
and maybe go in with the mindset that's particularly summer school is not remediation. And let's look at it differently. We've got
For sure.
families who are willing to do. I get a little concerned that we can't take care of all kids because we don't mandate you be there if you're in elementary. But if we look that we're in a different era, what could we do? Is it targeted? Is it, 3 weeks versus 6 weeks? Is it with real certified teachers, not people who are substituting? Our traditional summer school is not what our kids see every day in school. But I think the points made here are worth, and I hear you're going to do that.
I will absolutely do that.
But I think to Mr. McNally's concerns that maybe we're in a different place than traditional summer school. If that's an area that
I'm
people
happy to look into that and bring the research back. That explains it. And here's the options based on that research. Yeah. So just kind of our next steps really is that we're going to continue to work to make sure we have that guaranteed and viable curriculum. Each step we take puts us in a better spot to support PLCs and meeting the needs of the needs of each of their students. And then really we're going to continue to leverage our instructional support coach and our reading and math specialist to support PLCs as indicated by the data. So while we gave you an overview of where we are as a district, every building looks a little bit different and what their needs are, and really have been working to leverage all the resources we have to support kids in moving forward.
Do we, does the board have a breakdown in terms of how many instructional support coaches we have for each school?
I'm
read
not
the
sure if we have that. We can absolutely share that with you.
Could you circulate that to
Yep.
the board as well, down to the school
Yep.
level? I'm sorry?
has it changed? It was 1 per elementary school. And I think at the high school, it's 3. And
We'll give it
the
to you.
full
Yeah, because reading and math specialists for sure. Any other questions I can answer for you? All right, well, thank you. I will work on pulling these things together and get them out to you in the next, probably by the end of next week.
thank you, Dr. Igo. This will be posted, right? For people to see. And I think it was a good discussion, and I think it shows that you're on top of where we are currently. So I appreciate that. Anything more?
I was just going to say much the same. I really appreciate the transparency on what's going well, what's not going so well, so we can all be informed as to what are the best practices we can put in place. And I think it's comforting for all of us and certainly the community to know, here's where we're doing great. Here's where we're doing not so great. Here's where we're doing poorly. And here's what we're going to do to try and change that. I think for me personally, that's very comforting to know, because we need to know where we are in order to get to where we want to be. So thanks for covering some tough topics and some other celebrations as well.
I want to say thank you as well. I felt like the document was easy to read. It's always well explained. Well written, and is, same thing about highlighting things that are going well or where we're making a lot of progress, as well as areas we need to work on. So I really appreciate the way that you put this together.
I do too. Thank you so much.
So we have, for March, we have some resources coming, right? Is that still on?
We have our normal
Curriculum
renewal
replenish.
resources.
Yep.
Replenish. Thank you. That's the correct word.
It's your word on the document. And then we also talked about focusing on early childhood. At the listen, learn, and return, there was a lot of discussion and some information that was not quite accurate that that people have in understanding early childhood. So Mr. Kuchert and I asked Dr. Igo to have a presentation about early childhood so that the board and the community can be better informed. So that's the plan for March. Are there any other items that people are? Okay.
Well, we just heard about the one cohort who had the experience of not having over 80% of students in all-day kindergarten. I wonder if it's time to talk about all-day kindergarten again.
It's always time to talk about all day kindergarten.
It's the kindergarten people.
It was a headline today or two that we had lowered the cost again. So we'll put all day kindergarten as,
For
Okay,
March.
upcoming, I'm not sure if we can.
Yeah,
I don't know
I'm
that
not
we
sure
can
we
fit it in
can.
March, but we can
Yeah.
absolutely fit it in.
Help the agenda.
Okay. Anything else? Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation, and the L&T committee is adjourned at 6:40.